At the time of recording, I've recently finished a playthrough of Fire Emblem 15 Echoes Shadows of Valentia for the channel. It hasn't uploaded in its entirety yet, but it started off as an incredibly fun romp and ended up with, well, me sort of dragging my feet over the finish line. You see, in contrast with my co-host Casual Jacob, who loves the Valentia games with every fiber of their being, I don't care for them as much, and this playthrough was kind of eye-opening in that respect. I played a lot of SOV when I first got my 2DS, and while I didn't dislike it, it was never amongst my favorites. But coming back to the continent after such a long period of absence opened my eyes to some of the issues that I have with Valentia in general. While the presentation is immaculate, the story stumbles in some areas and definitely falls on the misogyny button quite a few times. While I could simply fix that by pressing start, there is less that I can do to help with the gameplay. The map design is frustratingly bland, with mostly big open fields, deserts, and swamps. And due to map spawns, dungeon encounters, and backtracking for promotion, there are quite a few of what I would call forced grinding maps, those being battles that are not actual story maps, but are not optional either. They're not challenging, they're just tedious and waste my time. So, despite how endearing the cast of SOV is, I find it difficult to get past these problems and spend some time with them. Which is a shame, because I truly do like the romance between Alm and Celica and the various interactions between all of the members of the Valentia gang. Well, lucky for me, there is actually a hack that takes the core of Shadows of Valentia, demakes it into the Sacred Stones engine, and attempts to fix all of these problems along the way. There are rewrites to the story, there are changes to the maps, and there's some mechanical alterations that sort of merge Valentia with GBA. It's an ambitious project, and the final product is actually quite popular, and I considered it my last chance to find a Gaiden game that I liked. Unfortunately, I failed that last chance. I know that this is going to be an unpopular opinion, and I promise I tried really hard to enjoy Sacred Echoes. There are aspects of it that work really well for me, and I think it does deserve some praise. However, this review is going to be mostly critical, because for everything that works for me, there are 2 or 3 more things that just endlessly frustrate me. Full disclosure, I did not finish this hack. I am just about at the end of Act 4. Celica's army is right outside of Duma's tower, and Alm's army is approaching Nui Baba's abode. After bouncing off a map with a bunch of incredibly damaged spongy barons for about 30 minutes, I decided that continuing to torture myself with this game was not going to make me like it anymore. And so I'm going to review Sacred Echoes from the experience that I had. That experience does not reach the endgame, but I do not think that killing Duma would change my mind on my opinions about this hack. To be clear, just because I don't like this game doesn't mean it's invalid for you to like it. Popular things tend to be popular for a reason, and there are definitely some redeeming qualities in this hack, which I will highlight. So don't feel that I am attacking you just because we have a different opinion on a video game. If you are willing to watch this video to the end before commenting, I would very much be thankful, because I know that it's going to upset some people that I didn't like Sacred Echoes. So thank you in advance for hearing me out. And in addition to that, thank you to my Patreons. They voted on this review to be the next one to go up. Well, technically they tie voted this and Shackled Power, so my mods were the tiebreaker. Look forward to Shackled Power coming soon. Big shout out to Game Boo, Fyrant, Cordelia Frey, Smaz Ruby, Autumn Kelsey, Jamie Collins, Marin Karen, Thick Molder, George Grenville the 7th PM, Danielle Kalaskis, Jagan is Nest, TB, Tailored Muffin, Herc, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Controlled Aegis, and Jeff. I think one of the first things that people notice about Sacred Echoes is the top-notch aesthetics. All of the Gaiden classes have been converted into GBA sprites, which means we get cool renditions of things like the Barons and Dread Fighters. While some of these are publicly available on the repo, others are unique to Sacred Echoes. For example, Alm has his own hero sprite, and the animations are incredibly smooth. I popped off every time Alm got a low % crit. Now, in fairness, Most GBA ROM hacks are going to have good battle sprites, but the way that Sacred Echoes sets itself apart is it aims to port pre-existing aesthetics into the GBA engine. And I think it pulls it off really well. These are some of the most gorgeous battle animations I've seen. And that also extends to the mugs, because, well, we're using a cast of characters that we already have artwork for. So these mugs are trying to capture something that already exists, and once again, doing it very, very well. The portraits really feel like official GBA version of Alm Celica and Friends. It's eye-catching. The familiar merged with the new, but both in a good way. And I think this really helps it stand out from the crowd. Of course, aesthetics isn't limited to the visual aspect, and there are beautiful renditions of the SOV OST, say that 5 times fast, put into GBA form, which is awesome. The title music alone is peak. Seriously, I pulled up the main menu to check a couple of things for this video, and then ended up just sitting there vibing out to the title screen music for like 5 minutes straight. It's really, really good. Moving past the aesthetics, there are a number of really good quality of life features added into Sacred Echoes. There is, of course, the standard explanation point when there's effective weapons, enemy ranges display, all the stuff that you come to expect from modern ROM hacks. However, Sacred Echoes takes it a step further and adds a bunch of options when starting a new game. You can choose between casual and classic depending on what you're in the mood for, as well as choosing between fixed or random growths. Additionally, there is a 0% growth mode and a 100% growth mode just baked into the base game. You don't have to download a separate file or anything, which is really neat. And you can even choose to play on 1RN, 2RN, or the hybrid Fates RN. I really like this degree of versatility, and it makes it so you can craft the experience that you want. In addition to picking between easy, normal, and hard, you get all of these other options to make your go through the campaign fit your tastes as best as it can. On that topic, both Alm and Celica's armies will start with a growth boosting item that gives plus 5% to growth rates to whoever your favoritism project is. Normally in GBA, these are Metis Tome or Alpha drops, but here it's been reflavored to be the orange. In fact, a lot of the various fruits and foods you can get in Gaiden have been repurposed into GBA adjacent items. And I think that's a really neat touch. I know it's cliche to call this a love letter to Valentia, but this is an aspect that feels like it. You can tell that the development team really cares about SOV. That said, they are not above making some changes. One of the big criticisms of SOV is that it just kept all of Gaiden's maps, which are not exactly the most creative things in the world. And so Sacred Echoes making a concrete effort to rebuild the maps is really nice. Most notably, we now no longer have every single map be a route fest. There's some kill boss maps, there's some siege maps, and there's even a few defense maps thrown in there. While I think that it is possible to make a good route map, I think that route is consistently one of the weaker objectives in Fire Emblem, only beaten out by defend and survive. As a result, I am a big fan of the transition from Route Land to Siege Boss Land. In addition to making alterations to the maps, Sacred Echoes also makes some changes to the core mechanics. It does not aim to recreate SOV or Gaiden one for one with a GBA aesthetic on top of it, nor does it aim to give you the Gaiden experience with GBA mechanics. Instead, it hybridizes the two of them, taking features from each one and having them sort of work together. From GBA, it lifts the fan-favorite rescue dropping system, as well as having mounted units able to do Canto after certain actions, such as trading or take dropping. This is by far the most popular aspect of the GBA system, so I'm unsurprised that this was included in Sacred Echoes. It does definitely boost the viability of Cavaliers and Pegasus Knights, but I think that they needed a little bit of help anyway, so this is overall a good thing in my opinion. Meanwhile, the most prominent features that it takes from Gaiden are the way that spells work and the way that promotion works. For those who are not familiar, in SOV, magical characters will learn spells as they level up, rather than equipping them as items. The spell lists are mostly lifted from SOV, although there have been a few additions, such as Bowie getting the Unlock spell, and Noma getting the Warp spell at base. I'm actually a really big fan of a Warper being added to Celica's side because of how obnoxious the swamp and forest maps can be in the late game. I just wish that he was around for the desert as well. As far as promotion works, the three main things to keep in mind are the promotion level is not always 10, you have to go to a Mila Shrine in order to promote, and rather than gaining flat stat boosts, you instead get elevated to class bases. Of course, there are also some mechanics that aren't really lifted from one game or the other, but kind of Frankensteined two different games' ideas together, in a way that works better than you would think. One prominent example of this is the way that inventory works in this game. While SOV and Gaiden famously only have one inventory slot, Sacred Echoes allows for 5, much like other GBA titles. For any units who use physical weapons, one of those inventory slots is always going to be taken up by the generic weapon type. So, for example, Cavaliers have generic lances, Mercenaries have generic swords, and Barons have generic swords, lances, and axes. Oh yeah, that's the other thing. Axes are now usable by some playable classes. Mostly it's the Armor Knights, although Atlas has a unique class to himself modeled after the fact that he used to be a lumberjack. These generic weapons will only take up one slot. Even if you have a generic sword, lance, and axe, it's still only one inventory slot total, and they do not have the weapon triangle. However, if you use another weapon, such as an iron, a horse slayer, a hammer, then those weapons will have weapon triangle, either advantage or disadvantage depending on who they're going up against. This means that you do get some combat forecasts where only one side of the battle is having weapon triangle advantage or disadvantage. It's a little bit more mental load to wrap your head around, but you get used to it quicker than you would expect. The one potentially controversial change to the way that weapons work is that most weapons have durability now. The Levin Sword is still infinite use, and a couple of other weapons, such as Almond Celica's personal weapons, are infinite use. But otherwise, yeah, anything that is not a generic weapon, its time on Earth is limited. Now, there are some non-weapon items as well, such as rings and shields. These do not give you an effect simply for being in your inventory, but instead you need to equip them. You have a weapon equipment slot and also an item equipment slot. This is basically like how items work in Path of Radiance. This does mean that you can boost both your offenses and defenses by equipping one item for each, and I like this idea. What can I say? It's lifted from Path of Radiance, and I'm a sucker for Tellius, so I'm on board anytime something is stolen from Path of Radiance. Speaking of things I'm on board with, the gay agenda. Now, SOV has Leon as a gay character already, but Sacred Echoes decided that one token gay is not enough, and I agree with this. So now, we get multiple members of the Alphabet Mafia. Jesse is confirmed in the postgame to be transmasculine. Conrad is heavily implied to be gay. Fernand receives a major overwrite, which includes him being gay for Clive. And there is a lesbian introduced as one of the OC playable characters. And I guess I should touch on them as well. There are 2 new playable characters to flesh out the rather small cast. The first one is a replacement for Atlas. Since Atlas has been promoted to dedicated axe fighter, his little brother gets to be the villager on Celica's side. His growths and spell lists have been ported over exactly to match Atlas and SOV. So I think that's pretty cool. On Alm's side, the original character is a lesbian thief who is in love with Silk and joins you during the Thief's Shrine to Spend map. As a unit, I think she is very fun. Because she's incredibly fast, you can throw the Levin Sword on her, and even when she's weighed down, she'll double a lot of people. As a result, she ends up dealing a lot of damage, and her lackluster strength growth doesn't really matter. She also functions as a GBA thief, because with the map reworkings, there have been things such as locked doors and treasure chests added. Thieves do have to use lockpicks, at least until they promote into Rogue, which is a little bit weird because both Alm and Celica have lock touch inherently. It makes the thieves feel kind of redundant. There are a few stealables that you can get, but they're very few and far between. As a result, while both Alm and Celica do get a thief in their army, they don't really feel like a great addition due to the way that skills are incorporated. And, well, while I'm being negative, and since we brought up skills, this kind of makes for a good transition into my first of many issues with Sacred Echoes. So, let's talk about the skill systems. Just like both of its namesake games, Sacred Echoes has several classes that have skills inherently tied to them. For example, archers gain bow range +1, snipers get bow range +2, barons get heavy armor which halves damage from bows, and cavaliers get canto. In addition to the skills that you would expect, there are some new ones. Mages now have access to swap. Barons and armor knights have pivot. Honestly, I'm a huge fan of movement skills, and these being added is not a bad thing. However, they're not really communicated to you, at all. Normally, when a unit has a skill in a ROM hack, it will be displayed on the status screen. Usually under stats, but sometimes on one of the other status screens. This is not the case in Sacred Echoes. Additionally, while it sometimes tells you that your units are going to get a class-based skill based on their promotion, it oftentimes doesn't. Now, in fairness, there is a README attached with the download link to the UPS file that lists out all of the skills and what classes they're associated with. However, there's nothing in the game that indicates where these classes are associated with specific skills, and I still think that's an issue. Putting basic information within a text README rather than the game itself is frustrating to me, especially because by default, these skills should be displaying on characters' bios. This means that the dev team went out of their way to remove information being displayed so that they could hide it away in a README. Compounding on this frustration, there's a lot of information absent from the README that I would have liked included. For example, Sacred Echoes has desert items, which is not something that was in the original Gaiden or SOV. This includes a pair of boots, the only pair of boots in the game. There's no mention of the existence of desert items anywhere in the README or the official resources on the Discord. I actually had to have a friend of mine send me the desert item map so that I could get them all. Thankfully, thieves still have a 100% chance to grab them, but other units do not. The README does mention the existence of a Gaiden chapter, however, it does not tell you how to get it, and considering that the unlock requirements are a little bit archaic, I find that somewhat frustrating. You see, for 2 story missions, Berkut joins your army, and if you get him a full level up before he leaves, then you'll unlock the Gaiden map. I didn't do this in my playthrough, and it's not because I was avoiding using him because he's an Orson archetype. I just didn't manage it because the experience is really tight in this game. Now, I was playing on hard mode, and I have been told that the experience gain is a little bit better on normal and easy, although I have also been told that it is still not nearly to the extent that it should be. I had been told that experience management in the early game is pretty tough. So I sandbagged Almond Lucas in order to try to focus as much experience as possible into the villagers to get them promoted by Thieves' Shrine, and I was not able to do this. Since the Thieves' Shrine was a defend map with a turn ceiling, I just wasn't able to get Cliff to level 3 by the end of it, and as a result had to come back later to get him his promotion to Mage. Now, Sacred Echoes does present a workaround to this slowed experience game in grinding maps. You can replay any of the shrine maps in order to grind experience, and I did this a few times during my playthrough. But I have a well-documented hatred of grinding. I think it is just the most boring thing imaginable, especially in Fire Emblem. As a result, I don't think that a campaign's leveling should be balanced around the player being expected to grind at several portions. It's also worth noting that even if you have a tolerance for grinding that I lack, the slowed experience gain means that grinding is a lot slower and a lot more painful. One example that really stood out to me was that in Leon's join map, he got 0 experience from chipping enemies 5 levels higher than him, and sub 10 experience for killing them. Even with a modicum of grinding, my team consistently felt behind the level curve. And this hurts even more because in hard mode, enemies are incredibly stat inflated. Now, typically in a ROM hack, I enjoy when enemies are threatening. I like having to leverage every tool I have against them. The problem is that Sacred Echoes just doesn't give you as many tools as these enemies demand. In Act 3, I ran into a map where a bow knight was positioned on the opposite side of a cliff from my team. His range was enormous, and he one-rounded 2/3 of my units. So I used Warp to send Forsyth, my highest trained unit, over to fight him with his personal weapon that is effective against cavalry units. He 3-rounded him with shaky accuracy, and didn't counter because, bow knight moment. In Act 2, I gave Saber, Celica, and Kamui swords so that they could fight the surprisingly bulky shield mages. But even if they doubled, they weren't able to one-round, and consistently they weren't even able to double. Because this game didn't port over combat arts, there's not much you can do other than manage your positioning and equip the correct weapons. And oftentimes that itself isn't enough. Even with effective weapons, your units will struggle to one-round, oftentimes requiring 3 or 4 people to team up on a single enemy. Since the enemies outnumber you vastly, this just isn't sustainable with the small army that SOV gives you. Worse still, we have some classic Gaiden hit rates, thanks to weapon accuracy not being great and terrain avoid being very, very bad. It is certainly an improvement from Echoes itself. After all, we no longer have the floor made of floor, but things like 20 avoid from forests very much still exist. Additionally, in a very Gaiden moment, you will usually have low percentage crit, but most enemies will have low percentage crit on you, which can sometimes just lead to getting blown out with nothing you could really do about it. It makes for a combat experience that I just find frustrating. One of the main appeals of Sacred Echoes to me was the lack of map spawns, meaning I no longer had mandatory grinding. But since enemy stats have been pumped up so much that it feels like grinding is expected, I now run back into the problem of nearly mandatory grinding. I could grit my teeth and power through it, but I'm already not having fun, why make it worse? Of course, the lack of grinding isn't the only thing that appealed to me about Sacred Echoes. A new take on maps was a big one for me, because by far my biggest issue with SOV and Gaiden by extension are the map designs. I was very excited to see this team's take on a journey through Valentia and what maps they would have me play. Unfortunately, I can't say that I was a fan of the changes that they made. Like, I don't think that these are inherently worse than the Gaiden maps, and on a whole, I think it is somewhat improved, but in general, I still find the map design to be fairly weak. Celica's army still has to move through a large number of desert and swamp maps. Rescue dropping with the flyers does help a little bit, but it doesn't alleviate the inherent issues that these map types have, especially as the deployment slots often end up being somewhat scattershot and make it difficult to get everyone you want to into the action. In fact, many of the most frustrating maps from Celica's side feel superficially different, but at their core, they maintain the same problems. On the other hand, Alm's campaign has significant overhauls to the map design. No longer are you slogging through the same couple of very empty maps, just dealing with enemy spam and the 4 cavaliers crossing the river and all that fun stuff. Instead, there are, well, really designed spaces. Unfortunately, those spaces kind of miss the mark for me as well. I mentioned the Thieves' Shrine Defend map before, and while it is conceptually very interesting, from a mechanical perspective, it ends up falling flat for me. There's a couple of choke points, and you just throw your toughest units there and move Alm to get some treasure. Bada bing, bada boom. While there are a couple of enemies that come from the left and right to slightly complicate things, the map doesn't really have any features that make it stand out, and so it ends up feeling kind of empty, despite being wholly original. On the other end of things, some of the maps do have very prominent features, but they are prominent, frustrating features. Classic GBA features such as Ballistas and Fog of War have been added to many of Alm's maps, and they are frustrating in almost every iteration. The first introduction to Ballistas comes in the river crossing map where you are using Fernand. There's a ballistician on an island in the middle of the river who zones out about a third of the map and will double your archers at this point unless you've done some significant grinding. And the same goes for one of the other more memorable new maps, Luthier's Village. It's a Fog of War map where about 2/3 of the map is taken up by forest tiles. This means everyone's going to have significantly reduced movement. Many of the enemies are mages with 3-range attacks, and you lack 3-range options on anyone other than archers and some of your mages. The Fog of War combines with the reduced movement to make taking on this particular class of enemy especially frustrating. And an added complication is that Alm must deviate from the strictest path to the Seas Throne so that he can recruit Luthier. Luthier's performance on that map is also pretty bad. Using a mage to fight mages just generally doesn't work. I feel bad being so down on these maps because it is clear that a lot of effort went into them. They aren't just one-to-one recreations of the Gaiden maps for the most part, but they really didn't work for me. The biggest highs that I got were figuring out ways to one-turn maps because I didn't want to deal with wyverns. There were a couple of fun boss kills, sending Forsyth, my primary boss killer, to specific bosses in order to get rid of them so I didn't have to deal with the map, was genuinely enjoyable. And I liked those experiences. I recognize that this is damning it with faint praise because the reason that I liked those was that I was motivated not to play the rest of the map. but it did still make for some fun warp skips, and I do feel the need to acknowledge that. Maybe it's just that I like a Forsyth to be reckoned with, and having him use his personal weapon, the Forsyth, to kill these mounted bosses always put a smile on my face. But yeah, I did enjoy that aspect of it. There is one other aspect of the design that I want to talk about, but fair warning, this is going to be the most negative part of the review. And that's because there are some design choices that I think are actively player hostile, and I want to discuss that. So this section of the review is going to be one of the most negative things I've published. As a result, I feel the need to preempt it by saying making a game that I personally do not like is not a moral failure. While I fundamentally disagree with the design decisions that went into Sacred Echoes, that doesn't mean that I have any issue with the developers themselves. It obviously goes without saying that you shouldn't harass anyone who I talk about, but I feel the need to emphasize it in this case because I am so negative on this game, and because I am going to start throwing around the term player hostility, as this next criticism is about something that I would describe as a player hostile decision. So I want to be absolutely clear. When I say I think these decisions are player hostile, that is not a moral judgment. That being said, I want to talk about Sacred Echoes' alterations to the RNG system. For those who are not aware, the GBA games do not actually generate true random numbers. Instead, they have a string of numbers in order, and they will pick the next one on the string anytime a random number is called for. This means that theoretically, if you perform every action identically, you will always get the same results. This is why Erica will always crit the first brigand she attacks in the tutorial of Sacred Stones. It's because that crit RN is used for the tutorial. Now, the way that Fire Emblem simulates randomness in the battle forecast despite this is it has other actions called the RNG string. Specifically, certain movements of the arrows when moving units will burn multiple RNs. This is why if you've ever watched a speedrun or a rigged LTC, you will see awkward jagged arrow movements. They know how many RNs they are burning with each movement, and as a result are doing that to rig either low percentage crits, certain dodges, or certain level ups. While this system can be abused by LTCers, speedrunners, or just general challenge runners, in standard play, it has the effect of effectively randomizing things. You might take the same strategy, having Erica attack 2 brigands and then Seth kill the 3rd. However, it is incredibly unlikely that you will always move your cursor in the exact same way unless you are intentionally doing so. As a result of this, randomness is simulated. I think it's a very elegant system. Sure, you can exploit it if you have perfect knowledge of the RNG string and are tracking everything, but that's something that is just not going to happen in standard casual playthroughs. And you do have the option of save stating and arrow dancing to rig crits, but at that point, you're save stating you've already decided that you're going to work outside of the game's system, so I don't necessarily think it's fair to hold that against the GBA. The devs of Sacred Echoes removed this feature, explicitly stating that it was to prevent the cheesing of Astra, Luna, and Sol, low percentage weapon drops on random maps. This choice had a lot of knock-on effects, all of which I believe are detrimental to the game's quality. However, I do want to examine the motivation because this is where I use the term player hostile. You see, while I don't think there's inherently anything wrong with trying to patch out an exploit, for example, I encountered an Infinite Revival Shrine exploit that the devs are currently working on fixing, the motivation behind this one just feels wrong. Anyone who is using arrow dancing to rig low percentage drops in random battles is either using the assistance of outside tools and knowledge, such as LTCers do, or abusing save states. And if someone is using save states in a single player game, then they've already decided they're not interested in engaging quote unquote honestly, and I don't think there's any problem with that. It is a single player experience after all. And if someone is using outside tools such as a Lua script or memorizing RNs in order to arrow dance effectively, then they've also decided that they're not trying to do a quote unquote normal playthrough. And again, single player game, doesn't really matter, let people play the way that they want. Contrasted with the revival shrines, which just happens if you only revive 2 people at a time, no one is going to encounter this by accident. If someone arrow dances to perfectly get a 1% drop and wasn't trying to do it on purpose, then that's just them perfectly getting a 1% drop because of the 1% chance. That's kind of how luck is supposed to work. All that is to say, I don't think the ability to rig low percentage drops is a problem worth confronting. But even if you disagree and think that it is an inherent flaw and needs to be fixed, there is a much simpler approach. FE Builder has an inbuilt scrambler. If you add the scrambler to your ROM, then the RNG will advance once per frame. This means that you can't rig low percentage things unless you're using an outside tool to check the RNs and pull off a frame perfect trick. And if you're doing that, we are well and beyond the point where someone is engaging with the game quote-unquote honestly. I get that technically you could still rig through a frame perfect trick, but do you have any idea how hard a frame perfect trick is? Instead, the RNs are fixed, and as a result, you can't effectively rig anything. This feels unnecessarily harsh to both LTCers and speedrunners. Now, speedrunners are kind of their own isolated thing, and to my knowledge, they typically don't interact with ROM hacks, so that's less of a big deal, but LTCers are a very entrenched part of the Fire Emblem community. And due to the finite number of mainline games, the LTC community often interacts to a great extent with the ROM hacking community, with many big-name LTCers either creating ROM hacks or LTCing ROM hacks. The devs know this will negatively impact LTCers, but either don't care or think that it is a worthwhile trade-off to preventing people from rigging 1% drops in random battles. It's just a frustrating and unnecessary move against one of the pillars of the Fire Emblem community, and feels like it runs counter to the option to select 0 and 100% growth, since those are most frequently used by LTCers. Well, and technically me, I use the 0% growths mode, because I'm weird like that. But even if you don't care about the way that this impacts LTC communities, this also has a large negative impact on casual playthroughs of the game. You see, without accidental arrow dancing, the RNs are locked in. You will always get the same results for your actions, and this is incredibly noticeable very early on. In Chapter 6, I ran into a situation where the RN string was such that I would just miss my first 3 attacks no matter what. I was unlucky enough to have 3 90% misses line up in a row, and because this is Valentia, nobody had 100% accuracy. I've talked about the need to gang up on hard mode enemies, and this just made the problem worse. And while this is the most extreme example, it's far from the only time that it happened. I ran into a number of situations where the turn 1 RNs just lined up in a really unfortunate manner, and I had to take very unintuitive actions to get them to work, attacking with people who dealt 0 damage or stuff like that. There was one chapter where the optimal turn 1 was to warp someone over a wall, but then not attack with them because I knew the first attack would be a miss and the second one would be a hit, therefore they would dodge and then kill on counter. And in a game that offers a 1RN mode, has very rare instances of 100% hit, and has most enemies have a low percentage crit on you, these situations are going to come up a lot. One of the issues that I have with hard mode is it often feels like you can't afford to miss, but you're facing 70 and 80% hit rates. The RNG being locked in means that sometimes you can't afford to miss, but you're guaranteed to. Now, I have been very negative in this review. I think Sacred Echoes is a hack with a lot of problems, and it should be clear to anyone who watched this far that it is just not the game for me. But tastes are subjective, and it might be the game for you. So I'm going to end this overly critical review with a recommendation portion for who might enjoy Sacred Echoes more than I did. If you are a super fan of Valentia and just want to see a new twist on it, then this might be for you. If you're a big fan of aesthetics and want to see one of the more gorgeous hacks in existence, then this hack might be for you. And if you're curious about the significant technical advances that have been made in the ROM hacking scene, this showcases a lot of them. Villager promotions, using the shrines to promote, revival shrines, stat booster shrines, there's a lot of cool stuff that you wouldn't expect to see in a GBA game. If you're the sort of person who enjoys grinding in Fire Emblem, then you also might enjoy this, because there is a lot of grinding to be had in Sacred Echoes. I would recommend playing on the lower difficulties if you choose to approach this hack, just to counteract some of the more significant issues I have, namely the experience gain. I know that there are a lot of people who really enjoy Sacred Echoes, and it's probably a little disappointing to you that I didn't. But I can only review the experience that I had, and the experience I had was not an enjoyable one. If you're looking for a positive review of Sacred Echoes, there are definitely quite a few out there. It has a good reputation. If you're one of the people that likes Sacred Echoes, then I'm curious to hear from you in the comments. It's not going to change my mind, but I'm genuinely curious to hear from the people that had a different experience with this game than I did. While you're down there, if you don't mind hitting the like button if you liked the video, then I would very much appreciate it. And subscribe, all that good YouTube stuff. Regardless, though, I hope you have a wonderful day.